never thought my closest friend would betray me like this, but sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty and friendship. My name is Patricia Campbell. I'm 63 years old, and I've always prided myself on being sharp as a tack. My late husband used to joke that I could spot a lie from 3 counties away, and my memory has always been one of my strongest assets. So when I started noticing strange looks from people around town, little conversations that stopped when I approached, I knew something was wrong. Before I reveal what really happened, please hit that subscribe button and like. I love hearing from viewers. What's your city? It all started 3 weeks ago at the grocery store. I was picking up ingredients for my famous apple pie when I ran into Mrs. Henderson from the church auxiliary. We'd known each other for 15 years, always exchanged pleasantries. But this time, she looked at me with this mixture of pity and concern that made my skin crawl. "Patricia, dear," she said, her voice dripping with that tone people use when they think you're fragile. "How are you feeling? Really feeling?" I set down my basket and looked her straight in the eye. "I'm feeling fine, Martha. Why would you ask?" She glanced around nervously, like she was afraid someone might overhear. "Well, I just heard that you've been struggling lately, seeing things that might not be there. I want you to know that it's nothing to be ashamed of. My Aunt Gertrude went through the same thing." The words hit me like a physical blow. Seeing things? Hallucinating? I stood there in the cereal aisle, completely stunned, watching Martha Henderson's face fill with what she probably thought was compassion, but looked more like schadenfreude to me. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Martha patted my arm with that condescending gentleness that makes you want to scream. "Of course, dear. Of course." I left my groceries right there and drove straight home to my daughter's house. Sarah Campbell Morrison has been my rock since her father passed 2 years ago. She moved back to town specifically to be closer to me, and if anyone would tell me the truth about my mental state, it would be her. I found her in her home office, working on her laptop with her reading glasses perched on her nose, looking so much like her father. It sometimes takes my breath away. At 34, she has his same focused intensity and my stubborn streak. "Mom?" She looked up immediately, sensing something in my expression. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Sarah, I need you to be completely honest with me. Have I been acting strange lately? Confused? Have I said anything about seeing things that weren't there?" She closed her laptop and gave me her full attention, the way she's done since she was a little girl. "Mom, sit down. What brought this on?" I told her about Martha Henderson, about the strange looks I'd been getting, about the growing feeling that people were talking about me behind my back. Sarah listened without interrupting, her face growing more concerned with each word. "Mom, you've been perfectly fine, sharp as ever. Last week, you helped me balance my checkbook because I couldn't find a $15 discrepancy, and you found it in 10 minutes. 2 days ago, you reminded me about my dentist appointment that I had completely forgotten. Does that sound like someone who's losing touch with reality?" The relief that flooded through me was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by a darker realization. If I wasn't having problems, then someone was spreading rumors that I was. "Then where are these stories coming from?" I asked. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. "I don't know, but we're going to find out. This is serious, Mom. Someone is trying to damage your reputation, maybe even worse." That evening, I called my dear friend Margaret Turner. Margaret and I have been friends for over 20 years, ever since we met at a book club that disbanded after 6 months, but left us with a friendship that I thought would last forever. She's been my confidant through my husband's illness and death, my cheerleader when I decided to go back to college at 60, my companion on weekend trips to antique shops. Margaret has always been the kind of friend who knows everyone's business, but not in a malicious way. She's just genuinely interested in people, and somehow information flows to her like water flows downhill. If anyone would know who was spreading these rumors, it would be her. "Patricia!" Her voice was warm and welcoming, as always. "I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up, sweetie?" There it was again, that tone. That careful, gentle voice that people use when they think you're fragile. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Are people saying that I'm having mental problems? That I'm seeing things?" The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Margaret, are you there?" "I'm here." Her voice had changed, become more cautious. "Patricia, maybe this is something we should talk about in person." "No, I want to talk about it now. What have you heard?" "Well, there have been some concerns raised about you lately. Nothing major, just that you might be going through a difficult adjustment period. It's completely normal for someone your age, especially after losing Robert." My blood pressure spiked so fast, I could feel it behind my eyes. "What kind of concerns? Raised by whom?" "Patricia, please don't get upset. We all care about you so much. Maybe you should talk to someone professional, just to make sure you're processing your grief in a healthy way." I hung up without saying goodbye, my hands shaking with rage and something that felt uncomfortably like fear. The next morning, my neighbor Tom Bradley knocked on my door. Tom is 75 years old, a retired electrician who's lived next door for 12 years. He's the kind of neighbor who brings in your packages when you're not home and always offers to help with anything that requires a ladder or heavy lifting. "Morning, Patricia," he said, holding a casserole dish. "Ellen made too much tuna casserole again. Thought you might like some." Ellen has been dead for 3 years, but I took the dish anyway. Tom's memory isn't what it used to be, but his heart is in the right place. "Tom, can I ask you something? Have people been talking about me lately?" His weathered face creased into a frown. "Talking about you how?" "Saying that I'm confused, or seeing things that aren't there?" Tom's expression grew serious. "Well, now that you mention it, Margaret Turner stopped by yesterday. She seemed real concerned about you. Said you'd been having some episodes, talking about seeing Robert around the house, getting confused about what day it was." The casserole dish slipped from my hands and shattered on my front porch. Tom and I both stared down at the mess of broken ceramic and tuna casserole, but all I could think about was one word: Margaret. "Tom?" I said carefully. "I've never told anyone that I see Robert around the house, because I don't. And I've never been confused about what day it is. Did Margaret say where she got this information?" Tom scratched his head, looking troubled. "She said you'd confided in her, that she was worried about you living alone. Said she thought maybe someone should check on you more regular-like." After Tom left and I cleaned up the broken dish, I sat in my kitchen and tried to make sense of what was happening. Martha Henderson had heard I was hallucinating. Margaret was telling people I was having episodes and seeing my dead husband. Both of them mentioned the same concerns, the same symptoms. But there was only one person I'd spoken to about any struggles I was having adjusting to widowhood. Only one person who knew the intimate details of my grief and my fears about aging alone. Margaret Turner, my best friend for 20 years, was the source of these rumors. Suddenly, the pieces aligned. I needed to confront Margaret, but first, I had to be absolutely certain. The thought that my closest friend might be spreading lies about my mental state made my stomach churn, but I couldn't ignore what Tom had told me. I decided to call Martha Henderson back. If Margaret was the source, Martha might reveal more details about how she'd heard these rumors. Martha, it's Patricia again. I'm sorry I hung up on you yesterday. Oh, Patricia, don't worry about it. I understand you're going through a difficult time. There it was again, that patronizing tone that suggested I was fragile. Martha, I need to ask you something directly. Where exactly did you hear that I was having hallucinations? There was a pause. Well, Patricia, I don't want to cause any problems between friends. Please, Martha, this is important. Margaret called me last week. She was very concerned about you. Said you'd been talking about seeing Robert in the house, that you sometimes forgot what day it was or where you'd put things. She asked if I'd noticed anything when I see you around town. My grip tightened on the phone. And what did you tell her? I told her you seemed fine to me, but that maybe she knew you better. She said you were good at hiding it, but that she was worried about you living alone. After I hung up, I sat staring at the wall. 20 years of friendship, and Margaret was systematically destroying my reputation. But why? An hour later, my doorbell rang. It was Margaret herself, holding a grocery bag and wearing her usual bright smile. Patricia, I brought you some things from the store. I noticed you were getting low on a few essentials when I was here Tuesday. I hadn't seen Margaret on Tuesday. She hadn't been in my house this week at all. Margaret, come in. We need to talk. She followed me into the kitchen, chattering about the weather and her garden. I watched her carefully, noting how she glanced around my house as if cataloging details. Margaret, I've been hearing some disturbing things. People seem to think I'm having memory problems, that I'm seeing things that aren't there. Her expression shifted to one of practiced concern. Oh, Patricia, are people talking? I was hoping to keep this between us until we figured out how to help you. The audacity took my breath away. Keep what between us? Honey, you've been struggling. Just last week you told me you thought you saw Robert sitting in his chair, and you've been so confused about dates and appointments. Margaret, that never happened. I have never told you or anyone else that I've seen Robert, and I'm not confused about dates. She reached across and patted my hand in a way that felt condescending. This is exactly what I was worried about, the forgetting, the denial. It's textbook, Patricia. My aunt went through the same thing. I pulled my hand away. Stop it. Just stop. I know what you've been doing. You called Martha Henderson and told her I was hallucinating. You told Tom Bradley I was having episodes. What I want to know is why. Margaret's mask finally slipped. Her concerned expression hardened into something colder. You want to know why? Because you're sitting in this house feeling sorry for yourself while the rest of us have to watch you waste away. Robert's been dead for 8 months, Patricia. 8 months, and you're still acting like a grieving widow. I am a grieving widow. You're wallowing. Do you know what it's like trying to include you in things? You turn down every invitation. You barely talk when we do see you. And yes, you have been forgetful. Maybe not hallucinating, but definitely not yourself. I stood up, anger flooding through me. So you decided to tell people I was losing my mind? I decided to get people's attention so someone would actually do something to help you instead of just letting you disappear into this house. By lying about me? By making people think I'm mentally incompetent? Margaret stood too, her voice rising. I exaggerated, yes. But Patricia, look at yourself. When was the last time you went anywhere besides the grocery store? When did you last have a real conversation with anyone? You're disappearing, and I couldn't just watch it happen. So, you thought destroying my reputation would help? I thought if people were concerned enough, they'd intervene. Get you to see a doctor, maybe get some counseling, antidepressants, something. I stared at my friend of 20 years, seeing a stranger. You could have talked to me directly. You could have said you were worried instead of going behind my back and making people think I'm losing my mind. Would you have listened? Really, Patricia? Because I've tried hints, I've tried gentle suggestions, and you brush everything off. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was Robert's son, David, calling from Seattle. I hadn't heard from him in over a month. Patricia, I just got a very concerning call from a Margaret Turner. She says you've been having some serious problems and that someone needs to check on you immediately. The blood drained from my face as I held the phone. Margaret was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part guilt, part defiance. David, I'm fine, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Margaret is here right now, actually. There's been some kind of misunderstanding. She said you've been hallucinating, seeing Dad around the house. She said you can't remember what day it is half the time, and that you're in complete denial about it. I looked directly at Margaret as I spoke. Margaret has been exaggerating things, David. Yes, I've been grieving. Yes, I've been struggling. But I'm not losing my mind. Patricia, I think I need to fly out there. Maybe we should look at some options. Get you evaluated by someone. Options? The word came out sharper than I intended. What kind of options? There was a pause on the other end. Memory care facilities, assisted living, places where they can monitor you if you're having episodes. My legs felt weak. I sank back into the chair, staring at Margaret in disbelief. You called my stepson and told him I need to be put in a home? Margaret's face flushed. I didn't say that exactly. I just said someone needed to evaluate the situation. David, I said into the phone, I don't need assisted living. I don't need memory care. I'm depressed, not demented. But Margaret seemed really concerned. She said you insisted you saw Dad last week, that you were adamant about it. I felt trapped between my own strange experience and Margaret's betrayal. How could I explain that I really had seen Robert, or thought I had, without proving her point? I was confused one day, that's all. Grief can do strange things to a person's mind, but that doesn't mean I'm incompetent. She also said you've been forgetting appointments, losing track of time. I missed one appointment, one. And yes, since your father died, sometimes the days blur together. That's called depression, not dementia. Margaret was fidgeting with her purse strap, looking increasingly uncomfortable. David, maybe you should let me talk to your stepmother for a while. We can sort this out. Is that Margaret? Let me talk to her. I handed the phone to Margaret with a look that could have melted steel. She took it reluctantly. David? Yes, it's me. She listened for a moment. I know it sounds extreme, but I'm really worried about her. Another pause. Well, maybe I did paint a more serious picture than necessary, but someone needed to pay attention to what was happening here. I could hear David's voice getting louder through the phone, though I couldn't make out the words. I understand you're upset, Margaret continued, but I couldn't just watch her isolate herself completely. She glanced at me nervously. Yes, I probably should have talked to you first before calling, but I thought time might be a factor. More talking from David's end. No, I don't think she needs immediate medical intervention. I just think she needs support, maybe professional help with the grief. Margaret's voice was getting smaller. Yes, I realize how that sounded. She held the phone back out to me. I snatched it from her hand. David? Patricia, I'm sorry. It sounds like Margaret meant well, but went about it the wrong way. Are you really okay? And I want the truth. I took a deep breath, very aware that Margaret was hanging on every word. I'm sad, David. I'm lonely. Some days I don't want to get out of bed, and some days I don't bother to check what date it is because it doesn't matter to me anymore. But I'm not hallucinating, and I'm not forgetting important things. I can take care of myself. The thing about seeing Dad? I hesitated, feeling Margaret's eyes boring into me. I had a moment where I thought I saw him. It lasted maybe 5 seconds before I realized it was just wishful thinking, or a shadow or something. Margaret turned it into a full-blown hallucination when she retold it. Okay, David's voice softened. Look, I'm still worried about you, but assisted living seems like a massive overreaction. How about this? Would you consider seeing someone, a counselor or therapist? Just to have someone to talk to? I can consider it. And maybe we could talk more often? I know I've been wrapped up in my own life out here, but I should be checking on you more. I'd like that. Good. And Margaret? His voice got louder. Next time you're worried about Patricia, call me first before you call half the town, okay? Margaret nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Yes, of course. I'm sorry. After David hung up, we sat in silence for a long moment. Margaret looked genuinely shaken. Patricia, I really did think I was helping. By telling people I'm losing my mind? By calling my stepson and suggesting I need to be institutionalized? I never used that word. You didn't have to. The implication was clear enough. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Robert's rose garden. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? How many people now think I'm mentally incompetent? I can fix this. I can call everyone back and explain that I overreacted. I turned around to face her. Can you? Can you really undo the doubt you've planted in people's minds? Once someone thinks you're losing it, every little thing you do gets seen through that lens. Margaret was crying now, but I found I didn't care. I was trying to shock people into action because nobody was doing anything. What exactly did you want them to do? Stage an intervention? Have me committed? I wanted them to reach out to you, to include you more, to encourage you to get help. By making me seem like a charity case or a crazy person? She wiped her eyes. I know I messed up. I know I went too far. But Patricia, you have to understand, watching you disappear has been killing me. You're like a ghost of yourself. So you decided to make me a ghost to everyone else too. Before Margaret could respond, there was a knock at the front door. We both froze. Are you expecting someone? Margaret asked. I shook my head, but a cold dread was settling in my stomach. Given how fast word traveled in this town, and given Margaret's phone campaign, I had a terrible feeling I knew exactly who was at my door. I walked slowly to the front door, my heart hammering. Through the frosted glass, I could make out 2 figures on my porch. I opened the door to find David standing there with his girlfriend Lisa, both looking concerned and slightly windblown from their drive. David? I blinked at him in surprise. What are you doing here? I thought you were calling from California. I was. We caught the red-eye flight. He stepped forward and hugged me, and I could smell coffee and airplane air on his clothes. I couldn't just leave things the way they were after that phone call? Lisa gave me a tentative smile. I hope it's okay that I came. David was so worried, and I thought maybe an extra pair of hands might help. Of course it's okay. I stepped back to let them in, though my mind was reeling. I just can't believe you flew all the way here. Margaret called me too, Lisa said quietly as they entered the living room. After she spoke with David, she was beside herself, saying she'd ruined everything and asking if we thought you'd ever forgive her. Margaret, who had been hovering in the doorway, looked mortified. I shouldn't have called Lisa. I was just so upset after talking to David, and I didn't know what to do. David looked between Margaret and me, clearly trying to read the situation. So where do things stand now? Have you two talked? We've talked, I said carefully. Margaret has explained her reasoning. And? David prompted. I glanced at Margaret, who was wringing her hands. Despite my anger, seeing her so distraught was affecting me. And I'm beginning to understand that her heart was in the right place, even if her methods were completely wrong. I was wrong, Margaret said quickly. I see that now. I thought I was being a good friend, but I was just making everything worse. Lisa sat down on the edge of the couch. Margaret told me some of what happened, about the phone calls and suggestions about assisted living. That must have felt like such a betrayal, Patricia. It did. I sat down across from her. It felt like everyone I trusted was conspiring behind my back. We weren't conspiring, Margaret protested. I was just scared. You've been so sad since Robert died, and then when you mentioned seeing him, I thought maybe you were having some kind of breakdown. David frowned. Wait, back up. You've been seeing Dad? I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Not seeing him exactly. It's more like moments where I think I catch a glimpse of him, but it's always something else. A shadow, or the way the light hits something. It only lasts a second. That sounds pretty normal for grief, Lisa said gently. I went through something similar when my mom died. I'd think I heard her voice calling my name, or I'd see someone with her hair cut and my heart would jump. Exactly, I said, grateful for her understanding. It's not like I'm having conversations with him or setting places for him at dinner. It's just wishful thinking that my brain processes for a split second before reality kicks in. David looked relieved. Why didn't you just explain it that way to Margaret? I tried to, but she was already convinced I was in crisis. I looked at Margaret. And honestly, I think I was so hurt that she'd gone behind my back that I stopped trying to explain and just got defensive. Margaret nodded miserably. I should have talked to you directly instead of calling everyone else. I should have asked more questions instead of jumping to conclusions. Yes, you should have, I agreed. But I also should have been more open about how I was struggling. I've been keeping so much to myself that maybe I did seem like I was falling apart. Lisa leaned forward. What do you mean, keeping things to yourself? I took a deep breath. The loneliness has been overwhelming. Some days, I don't speak to another person except maybe the checkout clerk at the grocery store. I've been turning down invitations because everything feels like too much effort. I know people are trying to include me, but I just want to hide. David's expression softened. Dad's only been gone 6 months. You're allowed to be struggling. But for how long? I asked. At what point does grieving become wallowing? At what point do people stop being patient and start thinking you need professional intervention? I don't think there's a timeline, Lisa said. But maybe there are ways to make it a little easier on yourself. Like what? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear suggestions. I'd been functioning in survival mode for so long that the idea of change felt exhausting. Well, Lisa said carefully, maybe we could start small. What if David came over for dinner once a week? Nothing fancy, just something regular so you know you'll have company. David nodded immediately. I'd like that. I've been wanting to check on you more, but I wasn't sure if you wanted space or company. Both, I admitted, which I know doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense, Margaret said quietly. I remember feeling that way after my divorce. I wanted people around so I wouldn't feel alone, but I also didn't want to have to perform being okay when I wasn't. I looked at her with surprise. Margaret had always seemed so put together, so certain about everything. I didn't know you felt that way. There's a lot we don't tell each other, apparently. She managed a small smile. Maybe we should work on that. David shifted in his chair. Can I ask you something, Mom? And please don't get defensive. I tensed automatically. Okay? When you see Dad, or think you see him, how does it make you feel? Are you scared, or sad, or what? I considered his question seriously. Hopeful, at first. For just that split second, I think maybe he's really there. And then when I realize it's not him, it's like losing him all over again, but smaller. Like a tiny grief that happens over and over. That sounds awful, Lisa said softly. It is, and it isn't. I struggled to find the right words. Sometimes those little moments are the only time I feel close to him. The rest of the time, he feels so completely gone that I can barely remember what it was like when he was here. David's eyes filled with tears. I think about him every day, but I don't think I see him the way you do. Maybe that's because you have your own life to focus on, I said. Your job, your friends. You're not sitting in the house where he lived, surrounded by his things, with nothing but time to miss him. Margaret leaned forward. Patricia, what if that's part of the problem? Not the missing him part, but the sitting alone with it part. I'm not ready to get rid of his things, if that's what you're suggesting. No, that's not what I meant. Margaret looked thoughtful. But maybe you could get out of the house more. Not for big social events, just little things. We could go grocery shopping together, or take walks. I felt a familiar resistance rise up. I don't want to be someone's charity case. You wouldn't be, Lisa said firmly. Margaret's not suggesting you're helpless. She's suggesting friendship, actual friendship, not the kind where one person makes decisions for the other behind their back. Margaret winced. I deserve that. Yes, you did, I said, but without the anger I'd felt before. But Lisa's right. What you're suggesting now feels different. David cleared his throat. There's something else we should probably talk about. The people Margaret called, they're all still wondering what's going on. Some of them have been asking me if you're okay. My stomach dropped. What have you told them? That you're grieving and working through it, and that's all they need to know. His voice was firm. But Margaret, you need to clean up the mess you made. You can't just let people think Mom is having a breakdown when she's not. Margaret nodded miserably. You're right. I'll call them back and explain that I overreacted, that you're doing better than I thought. Don't make it sound like I was ever not okay, I warned. Just say you misunderstood the situation. I will, I promise. Lisa had been quiet for a few minutes, but now she spoke up. Patricia, can I ask you something difficult? I braced myself. Go ahead. Are you taking care of yourself? I mean, really taking care of yourself. Eating regular meals, sleeping, basic things like that. The question caught me off guard because it was so practical. Mostly. I eat, but not always at normal times. Sleep has been harder since Robert died. The bed feels too big and too quiet. What about during the day? Do you shower, get dressed, that kind of thing? I felt defensive again. I'm not falling apart, Lisa. I'm not saying you are. I'm asking because sometimes when we're grieving, we let the little things slide, and then the little things make everything else feel harder. David was watching me carefully. Mom, when I came over last week, you were still in your pajamas at 3 p.m. So what? I wasn't going anywhere. But how did that make you feel? Lisa pressed gently. I thought about it, honestly. Lazy. Disconnected from the world, like the day didn't matter. And if you got dressed, even just to stay home, do you think you might feel a little more like yourself? Maybe. I paused. Probably. Margaret was looking increasingly uncomfortable. I feel terrible that I focused on the wrong things. I was so worried about whether you were hallucinating that I didn't ask about any of this stuff that actually matters. To be fair, I said, I probably wouldn't have told you the truth if you'd asked. I've been pretending I'm fine to everyone, including myself sometimes. David reached over and squeezed my hand. You don't have to pretend with us. Not anymore. But what if I'm not fine for a long time? What if I'm still sad and weird and antisocial 6 months from now, or a year from now? Then we'll figure it out then, Lisa said simply. But Patricia, there's something I need to tell you, and I hope you won't be angry with me for not mentioning it sooner. My heart sank. What now? 3 months ago, when you first called me to talk about Robert's death, you told me something that worried me, Lisa said carefully. You said you'd been hearing his voice sometimes, especially late at night. You said it felt so real that you'd actually answered him out loud a few times. The room went very still. I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment and something close to panic. You told Margaret about that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No, I didn't tell anyone. I promised you I wouldn't, and I kept that promise. But now I'm wondering if maybe Margaret picked up on something when she was visiting, or if you mentioned it to her too. Margaret was staring at me with wide eyes. Mom, you never said anything about hearing Dad's voice. You just kept talking to empty rooms, and it scared me because I didn't understand what was happening. David looked confused. Wait, back up. Mom, you've been hearing Dad? I wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. This was exactly why I'd been so careful about who I told what. It's not like voices in my head, I said defensively. It's more like muscle memory. When I'm making coffee in the morning, sometimes I say, "Want some?" Because that's what I always said to him. And for just a split second, it feels like he might answer. That's normal, isn't it? It sounds normal to me, Lisa said gently. But Patricia, is that all it is? Because you seemed more concerned about it when we talked before. I took a deep breath. These were the people who loved me most in the world, and I was tired of hiding pieces of myself from them. Sometimes at night, when I'm half asleep, I hear him say my name, and I know it's not real, but it's so clear that I answer before I can stop myself. The first few times it happened, I thought maybe I was losing my mind. That's why I called you, Lisa. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy. Margaret's face crumpled. And when I saw you talking to what looked like empty air, I jumped to the worst conclusion instead of just asking you what was going on. I'm so sorry, Mom. I made everything worse by panicking. But why didn't you tell me about any of this? David asked. He looked hurt. I'm your son. I should know if you're struggling with something this big. Because I didn't want you to worry more than you already were, I admitted. You just lost your father too. The last thing you needed was to think your mother was falling apart. But I'm an adult, David said. I can handle knowing that grief is complicated and messy. What I can't handle is finding out that my sister has been telling people you're having hallucinations when I had no idea you were dealing with anything like this. Lisa leaned forward. Patricia, what you're describing sounds like a very normal part of grief. A lot of people experience sensing their deceased partner's presence, especially in the first year. It doesn't mean you're having a breakdown? Really? I felt some of the tightness in my chest ease. Really? Your brain spent decades in patterns that included Robert. It makes sense that those patterns would take time to adjust. The fact that you know it's not really him shows that you're not losing touch with reality. Margaret wiped her eyes. I wish I'd known that before I started making phone calls. I was so scared when I saw you talking to yourself that I convinced myself you needed immediate intervention. Who exactly did you call? David asked, his voice taking on an edge again. Margaret looked miserable. Your Aunt Carol, my friend Janet, and Mrs. Henderson from next door. I asked them all to keep an eye on Mom because I was worried about her mental state. Margaret, I said, feeling a new wave of embarrassment wash over me. Mrs. Henderson is going to think I've completely lost it. I know, and I'm going to fix it. I'll call all of them tomorrow and explain that I overreacted to a normal part of grief. I'll make it clear that you're coping exactly like anyone would expect. David was quiet for a moment, then said, Mom, I understand why you didn't want to worry me, but keeping secrets like this just makes everything harder. What if Margaret hadn't misunderstood? What if you really were struggling and I had no idea? You're right, I admitted. I've been trying so hard to seem okay that I forgot it's okay not to be okay sometimes. And I've been so focused on watching for signs that something was wrong that I missed what was actually happening right in front of me. Margaret added. Lisa nodded. This is exactly why grief is so hard on families. Everyone's trying to protect everyone else, and nobody ends up feeling supported. I looked around at the three of them. These people who cared enough about me to sit in my living room on a Tuesday evening and work through this mess. So what do we do now? How do we do this better? Honesty, David said immediately. Even when it's uncomfortable. And patience, Margaret added. With you, but also with each other as we figure this out. Lisa smiled. And maybe some structure. Patricia, would it help if we scheduled regular check-ins? Not because we're monitoring you, but because it might be easier to share what's really going on if you know we're expecting to hear it. That might actually be helpful, I said. But what if what's really going on is that I'm having a terrible day and I cried in the grocery store? Then we'll want to know that too, David said firmly. Margaret nodded. And we won't assume it means you're having a breakdown. We'll just listen. I felt something shift inside me, like a door I'd been holding closed finally opening. There's something else I should probably tell you all then. Three faces turned toward me expectantly. Last week, I started writing letters to your father. Not because I think he can read them, but because I have all these things I still want to tell him. Is that weird? Not even a little bit, Lisa said warmly, but Margaret was frowning slightly. Mom, are you mailing these letters somewhere? No, I'm not mailing them, I said quickly, seeing the concern flash across Margaret's face. I just write them in a notebook and keep them in the drawer of Dad's old desk. The relief in her expression was obvious, and I understood why she'd asked. After everything we'd just discussed about misunderstandings and assumptions, I could see how writing letters to a deceased spouse might sound like a red flag. I think that's actually really healthy, David said. Grief counselors recommend that kind of thing, don't they, Lisa? Lisa nodded. It's a common and very healthy way to process loss. Some people write letters, others talk out loud. Some people visit the grave and have conversations. There's nothing concerning about finding ways to maintain that connection. I felt my shoulders relax. Sometimes I tell him about my day, or ask him what he thinks I should do about something. Yesterday I wrote about how frustrated I was that I couldn't figure out how to program the new coffee maker. Dad always handled all the electronic stuff, David said with a small smile. Exactly, and I found myself getting angry at him for leaving me to figure it out alone, which made me feel guilty, which made me more frustrated. I twisted my hands in my lap. The letter helped me work through all of that. Margaret leaned forward. Mom, that's exactly the kind of thing I wish you'd felt comfortable sharing with me. Not because I think there's anything wrong with it, but because it sounds like you were struggling alone when you didn't have to be. I could have come over and helped with the coffee maker, David added, or at least commiserated about Dad's terrible handwriting on all those instruction manuals he saved. The mention of the instruction manuals made me laugh despite myself. He kept every single one, even for appliances we'd thrown away years ago. I found a manual for a toaster we got rid of in 1987. But not the manual for anything we actually own? David said, and we all laughed. The laughter felt good, natural. It struck me how long it had been since I'd shared memories of my husband with anyone. I'd been so focused on not seeming like I was dwelling on the past that I'd stopped talking about him entirely. This is what I've been missing, I said quietly. Being able to talk about him without worrying that you'll think I'm not moving forward. Mom? Margaret said gently. Dad was part of our lives for decades. Of course we want to talk about him. Of course we want to hear your stories and share our own. Lisa was watching us with a thoughtful expression. Patricia, it sounds like you've been carrying a lot of assumptions about what healthy grieving should look like. Where do you think those expectations came from? I considered the question. I suppose I thought I should be more independent by now. That I should have figured out how to handle everything on my own. But why? David asked. Dad didn't handle everything on his own when he was alive. You two were a team. And now you have a different kind of team, Margaret said, gesturing around the room. It looks different, but it's still a team. I felt tears starting again, but these felt different from the frustrated, embarrassed tears earlier. These felt like relief. I've been so afraid of being a burden. And I've been so afraid of not catching signs that you needed help that I turned into someone you felt you had to hide from, Margaret said. We've been working at cross purposes. So going forward, Lisa said, what would it look like to work toward the same purpose instead? David shifted in his chair. I think it starts with me not calling Margaret every time I'm worried about Mom, and calling Mom directly instead. And me not treating every difficult day like a crisis, Margaret added. I took a deep breath. And me being honest about the difficult days instead of pretending they don't exist? That all sounds good in theory, Lisa said. But what happens the first time someone slips back into old patterns? Because that's going to happen. The question hung in the air for a moment. She was right, of course. We'd all been operating this way for months now. We call it out, Margaret said slowly. Gently, but directly. And we remember that one conversation doesn't fix everything, David added. I nodded, but I was thinking about something else. There's another thing, though. Margaret, when you were talking to people about me, what exactly did you tell them? Margaret's face went pale again. Mom, I promise I'll call them all tomorrow and explain. That's not what I'm asking, I said. I'm asking what you told them because I'm wondering if maybe some of what you were worried about was actually happening, just not in the way you thought. The room went very quiet. Margaret looked at me with confusion and something that might have been hope. What do you mean? I felt that familiar flutter of anxiety in my chest, but this time I pushed through it. If we were really going to be honest with each other, it had to start somewhere. I mean that maybe I haven't been seeing things that aren't there, but I have been experiencing things differently lately. Things that might have seemed concerning if you didn't understand the context. David leaned forward in his chair. What kind of things, Mom? The words felt heavy in my throat. For months, I'd been so focused on appearing normal that I'd never actually examined what normal meant for me now. I talk to your father sometimes, out loud, when I'm alone in the house. Margaret's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. And sometimes I'll set 2 cups out for coffee in the morning before I remember. Or I'll buy his favorite yogurt at the store without thinking. I paused, watching their faces. Last week I was laughing at something I remembered him saying, and Mrs. Chen next door asked if I had company. The silence stretched between us, but it didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt like space for truth. Is that what people were seeing? I asked Margaret, because I can understand how that might look worrying from the outside. Margaret nodded slowly. David mentioned you'd been talking to yourself when he stopped by, and Sarah said she saw you having a full conversation in your car in the grocery store parking lot. I was telling him about Margaret's promotion, I said, looking at my daughter. The one you got last month that you were so excited about? I wanted to share that with him. Lisa had been quiet through this exchange, but now she spoke. Patricia, how do those moments feel to you? The talking to him, the automatic habits? I considered the question carefully. It was the first time anyone had asked me that. They feel natural, comforting. Like he's still part of my daily life, just in a different way. I looked around the room. But I know he's gone. I'm not confused about that. I'm just not ready to stop including him in things yet. There's nothing wrong with that, David said firmly. I still find myself wanting to call him when something happens at work. I do the same thing, Margaret admitted. Sometimes I pick up the phone to tell him something before I remember. So we're all still talking to him in our own ways, I said. The difference is that I'm doing it out loud, and you're doing it in your heads. Margaret's face crumpled slightly. Mom, I'm so sorry. I turned something completely normal into a medical emergency in my mind. But why? I asked, and I genuinely wanted to understand. What made you jump to that conclusion? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was small. Because losing Dad was the worst thing that ever happened to me. And the thought of losing you too, especially to something like dementia, where I'd lose you gradually, it terrified me. So every little thing seemed like a potential warning sign. David nodded. I've been doing the same thing, just not as openly. Every time you seemed tired on the phone or forgot some small detail, I'd worry. So, you've both been watching me for signs of decline, I said, trying to process this. Which probably made you feel like you had to prove you were fine all the time, Lisa observed. Exactly. The word came out with more force than I'd intended. Do you know how exhausting it is to perform wellness for people? To make sure every phone call sounds upbeat, every visit shows that I'm managing perfectly? Margaret wiped her eyes. I never wanted you to feel like you had to perform for us. But that's what happened, I said. And when the performance got too tiring, I started avoiding you instead. David shook his head. We've made everything worse, haven't we? Not worse, Lisa interjected. More complicated, maybe. But now you're talking about it, which is the first step toward making it less complicated. I looked at my children, really looked at them. Margaret's face was blotchy from crying, and David's hair was sticking up where he'd been running his hands through it. They looked young and worried and guilty, and I realized they'd been grieving too, grieving their father and terrified of losing their mother. What if we tried something different? I said slowly. What if, instead of you watching me for problems and me trying to prove I don't have any, we just started sharing what's actually happening? What do you mean? Margaret asked. I mean, what if I told you that Thursdays are hard because that's when your father and I used to do the grocery shopping together? And what if you could tell me when you're worried about something specific instead of just generally monitoring me? David nodded slowly. So instead of me calling Margaret when I think you sound off, I could just ask you directly if you're having a tough day. And instead of me assuming that every difficult day means something seriously wrong, I could just accept that difficult days are part of life, Margaret added. That sounds healthy in theory, Lisa said. But Patricia, what happens when you are having a day that's more than just difficult? How do you want your family to respond to that? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on proving my independence that I hadn't really considered what I'd want if I genuinely needed help. I guess I'd want them to ask me what I need instead of deciding for me, I said finally. And what if what you think you need isn't what they think you need? Lisa pressed. Margaret and David were both watching me intently now, and I could see this was the heart of their fear. What if I couldn't recognize when I needed help? What if my judgment became compromised? Then I guess we'd have to figure that out together, I said. But we can't figure it out if we're not talking to each other honestly. There's something else, though, Margaret said quietly. Mom, some of the people I talk to about you, they might still think. She trailed off, but I could see where this was heading. They might still think you're having problems, I finished for her. The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Margaret nodded miserably. I was so worried about you, and I probably made it sound worse than it was. Mrs. Chen from next door, and some people at church, and... She pressed her hands to her face. Oh God, Mom, what have I done? The family therapy room felt smaller suddenly, the beige walls seeming to close in around us. Through the window, I could see the parking lot where normal people were going about their normal lives, not sitting in a therapist's office trying to untangle the mess their family had become. What exactly did you tell them? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Margaret's shoulders shook. I said you were talking to Dad like he was still there. I said you seemed confused sometimes. I mentioned that you'd been acting differently since the funeral. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I made it sound like you were losing your mind. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather squeaking under him. I might have said some things too. At work, when people asked how you were doing, I said we were keeping an eye on you because we were worried about your mental state. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, a steady drone that seemed to underscore the weight of what they were telling me. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not anger exactly, but a deep weariness. So now half the neighborhood thinks I'm having a breakdown, I said. It's not half the neighborhood, Margaret said quickly, then caught herself. But yes, some people think that. Lisa leaned forward slightly, her notepad balanced on her knee. Patricia, how does hearing this make you feel? I considered the question. A month ago, I would have been furious. I would have felt betrayed and humiliated. But sitting here now, looking at my children's guilty faces, I felt something more complex. Sad, I said finally. Not angry, just sad. Because it means that when I do go back to church or talk to the neighbors, I'm going to have to deal with their concerned looks and careful questions. Every conversation is going to carry this undertone of, is she okay? Is she really okay? David ran his hand through his hair again, making it stick up even more. We could tell them they were wrong. We could explain that we misunderstood the situation. Could you? I asked. Because that would mean admitting that you were wrong to be worried, and I'm not sure either of you is ready to do that yet. The silence stretched between us. Outside, a car door slammed, and I heard the muffled sound of someone laughing. Normal sounds from a normal world that felt very far away from this small room where we were picking apart the delicate threads of trust and family loyalty. "The thing is," Margaret said slowly, "I don't know if I was completely wrong to be worried. Maybe I was wrong about what I was seeing, but Mom, you were different after Dad died. You were sad and distant, and sometimes you did seem confused. Grief can look a lot like confusion from the outside," Lisa observed. "But how were we supposed to know the difference?" David asked, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. "How were we supposed to tell the difference between normal grief and something more serious?" I looked at my son, this man who still sometimes seemed like the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. "You weren't supposed to know the difference alone," I said. "You were supposed to ask me. But what if you couldn't tell us? What if you didn't know yourself?" The question hung between us like a bridge we weren't sure how to cross. I could see Lisa watching all of us carefully, her expression thoughtful. "That's the fear, isn't it?" I said. "That I might not recognize if I'm losing my grip on reality. That I might think I'm fine when I'm not." Margaret nodded wordlessly. "And my fear," I continued, "is that every time I'm sad or forgetful or just having a hard day, you'll interpret it as evidence that I'm not capable of taking care of myself." "So, where does that leave us?" David asked. Before I could answer, Lisa set down her pen and looked at all three of us. "It leaves you with a choice. You can continue to operate from fear, with Margaret and David watching Patricia for signs of decline, and Patricia performing competence to prove she's fine. Or you can try something harder." "What's that?" Margaret asked. "You can try trusting each other enough to be honest about what you need and what you're afraid of, even when those needs and fears don't match up perfectly." I felt something shift in the room, a subtle change in the air pressure. "What would that look like practically?" "Well," Lisa said, "it might mean Patricia telling you when she's having a particularly difficult day instead of hiding it. And it might mean Margaret and David expressing their concerns directly instead of talking to other people about them." "But what about the people who already think Mom is having problems?" Margaret asked. "What about the damage that's already been done?" Lisa looked at me. "Patricia, what do you think about that?" I thought about Mrs. Chen, who had lived next door for 15 years and had brought casseroles after Robert died. I thought about the women at church who had known me since Margaret and David were small. These weren't strangers whose opinions didn't matter. "I think," I said slowly, "that I'm going to have to decide whether I care more about what they think or about rebuilding trust with my children." But even as I said it, I wondered if it would really be that simple. Because tomorrow I would have to face Mrs. Chen's concerned glances and the church lady's careful questions, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation yet. The silence stretched between us, filled with 15 years of accumulated worry and love and misunderstanding. Through Lisa's office window, I could see the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, and I realized we had been here for nearly 2 hours, circling around truths we had been too afraid to speak directly. "I think we need to start smaller," I said finally. "Before I worry about what anyone else thinks, we need to figure out how to talk to each other." David shifted in his chair, his hands still clasped tightly in his lap. "I don't even know where to start, Mom. I've been so scared of saying the wrong thing that I stopped saying anything real at all. And I've been so determined to prove I was fine that I stopped letting you see when I wasn't," I admitted. "After your father died, I thought strength meant never admitting I was struggling. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. But we wanted to help. We just didn't know how. Lisa leaned forward slightly. What would it look like if you started being honest about the small things? The everyday struggles that everyone has? I thought about the mornings when I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring at Robert's empty chair and feeling the weight of loneliness settle over me like a heavy blanket. I thought about the nights when I heard noises and wished desperately that someone else was there to investigate them. These weren't signs of mental decline. They were signs of grief and adjustment and the simple human need for companionship. I get lonely, I said, the words coming out more quietly than I intended. Some days I get so lonely that I talk to your father's picture just to hear a voice in the house, even if it's my own. Margaret's breath caught. Mom, that's not crazy. That's just missing him. I know that intellectually, I said. But when you started watching me so carefully, I began to question everything I did. Was it normal to keep his coffee mug on the counter? Was it healthy to leave his books exactly where he left them? I started second-guessing every choice. David unclenched his hands and leaned forward. I had no idea we were making you feel that way. I thought we were being supportive. You were trying to be, I said. But support and surveillance aren't the same thing, even when they come from love. Lisa nodded. Margaret, David, can you tell your mother what you were really afraid of? Margaret wiped her eyes with the tissue Lisa offered. I was afraid you would fade away like Dad did. Not physically, but that we would lose the essence of who you are. You've always been so strong, so capable. When I saw you struggling, I panicked. And I was afraid of being responsible for making the wrong choice. David added. What if something happened to you because I didn't speak up? What if I missed the signs that you needed more help? The honesty in their voices broke something open in my chest, a knot of resentment I hadn't even realized I was carrying. You were afraid of losing me, and I was afraid of losing my independence. We were all afraid of the same thing, really? We just went about protecting ourselves in ways that hurt each other? Lisa made a note on her pad. So what do you need from each other going forward? I looked at my children, really looked at them. Margaret had her father's thoughtful expression, the way he used to furrow his brow when he was working through a problem. David had inherited my stubborn chin, though I had never noticed how much he resembled me when he was worried. I need to know that you trust me to ask for help when I need it, I said. And I need to actually do that, ask for help, instead of pretending everything is fine. I need to know that you're not just performing okayness for our benefit, Margaret said. I need to know that when you say you're fine, you actually mean it. David nodded. And I need to learn the difference between being concerned and being controlling. I think I crossed that line without realizing it. Lisa set her pen down and looked at all three of us. Those are all reasonable needs. The question is whether you're willing to practice meeting them, even when it feels uncomfortable. Outside, the shadows had grown longer, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic as people made their way home from work. Soon, we would leave this office and return to our separate houses, but something fundamental had shifted between us. There's still the matter of what Margaret told other people, I said, not accusingly, but acknowledging the reality we would have to face. Margaret's face flushed. I know I can't take that back, but I can make sure that, going forward, if I'm worried about you, I talk to you first. And if I do need to talk to someone else about my concerns, I'll tell you that's what I'm doing. That feels fair, I said. And I promise that if you come to me with a concern, I'll really listen instead of just getting defensive. David looked between us. What about me? How do I rebuild the trust after going along with talking about Mom instead of talking to her? I reached over and took his hand, feeling how much larger it had grown since he was the little boy who used to help me bake cookies. You show up, you keep showing up, and you practice doing it differently. As we gathered our things to leave, I felt lighter than I had in months. The problems weren't magically solved, the hurt feelings weren't instantly healed, but we had created a foundation to build on. Walking to our cars in the parking lot, Margaret fell into step beside me. Mom, would you like to come have dinner with us this week? Not because I'm worried about you, but because I miss spending time with you. David joined us at my car. And maybe we could start a regular thing. Not a check-in, just family time. I looked at both of them, these adults who had once been my babies, who were now trying to figure out how to love me without smothering me. I would like that very much. As I drove home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I realized that healing wasn't going to be a destination we arrived at, but a practice we committed to. We would probably make mistakes, hurt each other's feelings, fall back into old patterns. But now, we had tools to find our way back to each other. The house felt different when I walked in, less like a monument to the past, and more like a home where the future was still being written. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my chair by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow I would call Margaret and David, not because I needed anything, but because I wanted to hear their voices. I would practice the difference between connection and obligation, between love and fear. For now, though, I sat with my tea and felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. The quiet satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged, problems and all.